Welcome to another episode of the Power Law Investor. Today is May 17th, 2025, a Saturday. And as I make this video, Bitcoin is trading just a hair below, at 103,000, and Kaspa is trading just above 11 cents. And today we're going to catch up on how the weekly DCA or daily DCA is progressing along. What I think is likely going to come down the pipeline, and why I think it's a good time to keep on investing and building up resources in for towards Kaspa, but the timing for that is going to be a little hard to call, and that's why DCA is probably the best option that we have at this point. So let's start off with a quick summary of what the power law is. The power law essentially takes the log of the x-axis, that is the days since the start of the cryptocurrency launch, and the log of the price, and plots them on a standard graph. And then by taking a linear regression trend line, we're able to find a trend line highlighted here in orange that shows rather strong tendencies with a high R-squared fit, meaning that the linear trend line does a really good job of replicating or illustrating or following the price patterns. And so this allows us to, and a good measure of that is the R squared, which is at 0.966, which means more than 96% of the variation in price is exhibited by this blue line is explained by the orange line. That's a pretty solid fit, and this is a standard technique called linear regression. And this is the equation over here. Now, when we take this particular equation and convert everything into the linear space, which is what we're used to, we end up with something like this. The straight line becomes a curve, and we see that the curve does a good job of illustrating what the trend for the price has been with a high degree of mathematical precision. And it's not just drawing lines, virtual lines, saying, oh, this is my opinion. This is a mathematically rigorous and standard way of doing things, right? And then if we then make the assumption that the future is going to be like the past, we can extrapolate and see what sort of returns we can expect going forward, right? So based upon these particular measurements, the trend value today is around 113K. Bitcoin is trading at 103, so 10,000 below. And we expect in 6 months' time, the price is going to be about 136. And in 12 months' time, the price is going to be about 162,000. So for the next 6 months, we expect about a 30% return. For the next year, we expect about a 60% or 55% return, assuming that the blue line matches the orange line. Oftentimes, the blue line can overshoot the orange line, and you can expect considerably more. So this is for Bitcoin, and we can expect, in my opinion, probably at least a price of about 162, and likely it can go on more than that. And I've seen quite a few people come up with measures for about 200K in Q4 2025, Q1 2026. That's not unreasonable based on past behavior, and this is sort of mathematically designed or mathematically derived. Similarly, another crypto, Kaspa, also was exhibiting previously the same sort of tendency that Bitcoin was following this power law. This particular mathematical formulation in linear space is called the power law. But you can see that it was following, and then ultimately has recently, since about September last year, has dropped below, but now seems to be bouncing back. And if we do the same sort of calculations, we notice that we have an R squared of 0.88, which means about 88% of the variation in the blue line is explained by the orange line. And if we convert that into linear space, we see that it has a steeply increasing upward curve. And we can see that we're way below what this curve right now. We have started shooting back up again. And so if we make the assumption that the future is going to be like the past, and this is going to follow a similar tendency to Bitcoin, we can come up with estimates for what we can expect in a year's time. So with a price of about 11.5 cents in a half a year's time, we can expect a price of about 46 cents, and in a year's time, we can expect a price of about 70 cents, leading to about a 300% return on a 500% perspective. And of course, the trick is to try and see whether we really believe that is it going to go and follow this trend line again, or is the trend line broken, right? And if we look at these particular support lines. It's a 50% to the trend line, 40% to the trend line, and 30% to the trend line. Typically it was bounced. It wouldn't go much below this 40% trend line, but then it would crash below the 50% trend line, and then below, much further below that also, right? The only time that has happened previously was right at the beginning when Kaspa, this is for Kaspa over here, the other cryptocurrency I'm talking about, was previously introduced. And so this has caused a lot of people to question whether we think that the power law is broken. Is it merely bent? What's going on? And the answer to that is no one really knows. Right? I can tell you that this is what I think is going to happen, but it's going to be a probability because no one knows the future. And anyone who tells you that they know the future, you should probably go running away from. All right. What we can say is that we know that it was following this power law to a large extent. And the R squared is still fairly decent, although not as good as it was before. We do have only about 1,080 days of data versus more than 5,500 days of data for Bitcoin, so 5 times as much. So we have to keep that into account and say, hey, this is still a relatively young crypto. It definitely had some properties that were reminiscent of Bitcoin. It is a proof of work, but we don't know whether it's going to come and follow back along this trend line or not. Based upon this, not knowing, the best strategy has been to go in with a DCA approach and increase the DCA as the price has gone down. For me personally, I think there is a high probability that not only will this come back to the trend line, that is the power law, but it potentially will exceed it also. I can't be sure about that, but I should be willing to take the risk. And because I can't predict what prices are going to be like, I'm going to buy a regular amount of Kaspa on regular intervals. And I am going to keep that dollar amount, and maybe even increase that dollar amount as the price goes down, because I have faith that this thing is going to work out, right? And that comes to that question of having the faith. It's important to realize that Kaspa uses some rather clever techniques to come up with rather fast transactions per second and quick confirmation. So it definitely has a technological edge. However, the environment has changed so much since Bitcoin was first introduced. There are thousands of competing cryptocurrencies, so we don't know for sure. But based upon what my expectations were for the growth of Kaspa relative to the growth of Bitcoin, and also trying to be opportunistic along the way, we started along this journey for the Power Law Investor, in which I'm deploying a fixed amount of capital every day, right? And initially, I started up deploying $100 a day, and as the price went down, I started deploying $200 a day. And in my last video, I said because I thought the price had gone down even more, I'm deploying $300 a day. And the distribution of that is 20% into Bitcoin, 60% into Kaspa, and 20% into cash. So the 20% into Bitcoin and 60% into Kaspa comes from looking at the relative confidence we have in their power laws and what sort of returns we can expect. So for Kaspa, we can expect much higher returns. For Bitcoin, we're looking at 56% for the year, and Kaspa, we're looking at 500% for the year. So there's a big difference. So given that, I would want to put more of my DCA into Kaspa on a daily basis, but there's also much less confidence in Kaspa, so I don't want to be putting everything into there. I want to be splitting my assets. And then the 20% of cash comes about because we might get some absolute crazy prices, and we don't want to be just DCAing, and we want to be buying more when the price goes down and have the opportunity to deploy cash. So on my last video, I told you that I was switching to deploying from $200 daily to $300 daily. Again, splitting in this 20-60, 20%, and that I had put a Kaspa limit order for Kaspa, which has not been filled, at just above 5 cents in case we got that price. And so the strength of this approach is that since we've been doing this from August 19th last year, is that it has steadily pushed down the cost of Kaspa that I'm paying. The spreadsheet is something I used to keep track of, and also for you guys to be able to see, hey, what are the decisions that I've made? And the Kaspa spent to this date has been 30K, but we're sitting on a profit of about $5,600, and the overall portfolio return is 12%, which isn't much. But for an altcoin heavy portfolio, you can see that this has done reasonably well, just because it keeps on buying Kaspa as the price goes down. And now when the price has shot up to about 11.2 cents or whatever it is right now, we're sitting on some sort of profit. So the average price paid for Kaspa is just below 10 cents. The average price paid per Bitcoin is $83,000, which is considerably lower than the current price of $102,000, $103,000. So that sort of gives you the idea that as a relatively long-term investor, and long-term investor, I would say, has a time horizon in the crypto space of at least 12 months or more, I am trying to come up with an easily replicable strategy that I'm sharing with you guys, that you can see, hey, here is a crypto that this guy believes has some potential. There are some mathematical tendencies that we have seen through this. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I can take a calculated risk that I think this has a good risk to reward payoff. And the best way for me to try and minimize my risk is by buying on a daily basis, and also keeping some cash to buy when the prices drop down low. And the question comes about is how do I believe that this particular alt, Kaspa, is going to be one of the big winners? I don't know if it's going to be one of the big winners, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the evidence that I'm seeing that may make you think that, hey, this is not going to be the big winner. But it still could be a great strategy and a good way to get exposure to the the altcoin market in a step-by-step sort of mathematically rigorous, low emotion kind of way. Right? Of course, I hope that Kaspa definitely does have some tendencies, some innovations that other cryptos don't have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's someone that's going to catch fire. So right now we're sitting at about a 12% return, which isn't bad compared to what you would probably get in the stock market. But of course, you could be making tons more if you were able to figure out things within the meme coin market or trading back and forth. But this is just a low emotion way of getting some exposure. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about what I foresee happening with Kaspa. So here's the price chart. You can see that basically since about September of last year, we sort of have been in this sort of downward trajectory. Although since from early April this year, things have shot up considerably. Now we're at about 11 cents. I don't think it's time for alt season as yet. Alt season is the time when you find massive increases in the crypto alternate or the altcoin market on a daily basis, 20, 30% sort of moves. I don't think it's going to quite be there as yet, because I think we really have to wait for the Fed to stop quantitative tightening and start quantitative easing. And given all the disruptions that have been going on in the overall stock market and the tariffs and everything else, I think there's a good chance that the Fed will be forced into doing that later on this year. So my anticipation is that until Q4 of 2025 is when we see a lot of action take place. I think it's going to kick off with Bitcoin and then transfer on to the altcoins as people look for opportunities to sort of get big returns. Okay. That being said, there are a few warning flags with Kaspa in particular that I'd like to point out. Right. So here's looking at Kaspa versus Bitcoin, and you can see that we've been on a big downslope since September, and only now in about April things have started to go up. And I don't know whether we would go back to this level again over here, but we much likely could. We can easily have this come and test this particular section all again. I don't do technical analysis, but I'm just saying that, hey, I don't know, and I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Right. The other thing is, even relative to the altcoin market, we're sort of seeing that Kaspa hasn't been doing particularly well. Again, since about September last year, we've been sort of seeing a steady decline. And even now, since April, we really haven't even been hanging with the rest of the altcoin market. This is Kaspa divided by the altcoin market cap. Right? And you can see that we're still going down. So in this sense, we're seeing that Kaspa is considerably weaker than the altcoin market as a whole. Now, there are different fads, there are different phases the market goes through. But this is where it's really important to do your own research and figure out, hey, is this something that is going to have some legs, or is this something that is a coin that is going to be a relic? Right? And everyone's going to come to a different conclusion on that. So see, contrast this pattern over here with what you see for Tau BitTensor, right? Which you can see that from April, it sort of started taking off and has done better than the altcoin market as a whole. Now, for me, Tau has been something that I have struggled to understand, and I prefer to focus on things that I do understand, because when I focus on things I don't understand, I end up losing money. But for those of you who do understand Tau and are believers in that, you can see how a stronger performing altcoin has done. You have this curve all the way up here from April, whereas compared to what you see with Kaspa, we're still seeing this go down. It's sort of been flat and a little down. And overall, we also want to check out is how do we think the altcoin market is doing versus the Bitcoin, right? If you sort of look at those two big reservoirs, and you'll see that in the last cycle, we basically went down all the way to 0.18 or 0.25, depending on how you want to call these different bottoms over here. And right now, the ratio between the altcoin market and the Bitcoin market is about 0.35. So if you believe that history repeats itself in a certain periodicity, then you do expect that the altcoin market is going to go down somewhat before it starts shooting up. Now, it may or may not happen. I don't know, which is why we adopt the DCA approach. But in case that does happen, this 20% cash reservoir has been building. As you can see, there's a cash limit order for half the available cash set up at 5 cents. I don't know whether we're going to have that, but likely once the price drops down, if the price drops down to 7 cents or below that, I will start deploying some of the available cash that I have in order to reduce my average cost down further. And that's because really, I think in the long term, and again, I mean by the end of 2025, I expect the price of Bitcoin to be north of 150, 160K, probably around 200K if that happens. And if that's going to happen, which we've seen happen regularly with the cyclic nature of Bitcoin, you can expect that these other altcoins are also going to do as well. Now, like we said, Kaspa has been underperforming the altcoin market as a whole, but even then, it's likely going to do considerably better than when it is right now. And if I believe that is the case, well then, if I can buy this when it's at 7 cents, or it goes up to 50 cents or 40 cents or 70 cents as the math here predicts, that would be a pretty fantastic return. So that's sort of the overall strategy at this point. It's important not to get shaken out of the market and make any rash decisions and decide to sell immediately. If we don't hit the peak of Bitcoin in Q4 2025, Q1 2026, then I think there's a case for us to think that, hey, this is not going to turn out and may not be a great investment, and maybe I should start getting out of it when I get reasonable peaks of the price. But for now, this is just a temporary lull before things start picking up, in my opinion. And it seems that we're really going to have to wait until the Federal Reserve starts its quantitative easing program. Whether they call it that or call it something else, we won't know, but that's sort of the strategy. So again, this is what my thoughts are. You should do your own research. This isn't financial advice, but I hope this gives you more of a quantitative lens into how I'm thinking about the distribution of assets. And thanks for listening. So please like and subscribe and click the notification bell. That will help the channel grow, and see you on the next one.